A quick introduction. My name is Jake Glass, and I work with C4ADS on our flight tracking platform, Icarus Flights, and have been doing flight tracking research in open source and publicly available space for the past 3 years now with C4ADS, and then also as personal research, and something I'm very excited about. So very excited to share with you all here.
Briefly, hello everyone, I'm Eva Khan and I'm an analyst at C4ADS. I work on our conflict finance and irregular threat cell, and I focus on Sudan and South Sudan. Today I'll be talking about tracking flights in the Middle East broadly and helping you all through a few case studies.
All right, great. Thank you, Eva. So just to start off, I wanted to share a brief agenda for what we're hoping to cover. We sent out through Pathable a form for you all to suggest aircraft of interest that you might want us to investigate a little bit during this. So we're leaving time near the end, hopefully to touch on 1 or 2 of those, as well as showing you a number of case studies of our own that we have found in our research and through alerts generated by the Icarus Flights tool. So we'll just cover what C4ADS is really quickly, and then we'll jump into aircraft tracking basics. And we'll dive pretty deeply into how to track aircraft, how they are tracked, what aircraft transponders look like, how we identify aircraft, and how we look up ownership information. And then we'll do some practical examples, which Eva will share with us. And then we'll show you Icarus Flights and dive into that tool with some live demos that we're excited about. So just briefly, C4ADS is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and we use data and technology, both publicly and commercially available information, in order to create research on transnational conflict and security issues. So anything that crosses the border, anything in the realm of wildlife trafficking, counterproliferation, non-state actors, kleptocrats. All of these things are of interest to us, and we try to create research and work with organizations that can create actionable impact from that research. And so creating tools like Icarus Flights and gathering flight data and partnering with ADSB Exchange, which is an aggregator of this flight data, those are all core parts of our mission. And then sharing the Icarus Flights tool and sharing some of the knowledge that we have gained in aircraft tracking research with journalists and investigators like yourselves. Those are all core parts of our mission. So I want to start off talking about some of the fundamentals of aircraft data, the different in which you find aircraft data, which all sort of work in tandem in order to help us do interesting research, basically. So oftentimes the first place you will see a plane is in an image. Maybe that's in a social media post. Maybe it's a source has sent you an image of an aircraft on a runway. You want the tail number to be visible in this image, like in this tweet by the National Crime Agency in the UK on the right here. And you can see that when the tail number is visible, you can then use that to look at ownership information. And you can also track aircraft by following the data that their transponders transmit when they're flying around the world. And there are open sources for that I'll be talking about in a moment. And then also I'll go over some of the caveats of ownership data, its availability, and yeah, some of the caveats of that entire thing. But the good news is that even though there are gaps in flight tracking data, in ownership data, you might not always be able to find an updated picture of the aircraft you're looking for. Each of these data verticals works in tandem with the others to fill those gaps in. So how can we track aircraft? And the answer is a system called secondary surveillance radar, which is increasingly being employed instead of costly radar systems. So radar is an active system that's employed by fairly expensive equipment on the ground that has large antennas, and which is generally something that medium and large airports use in order to identify what is in their airspace. Radar isn't able to detect the altitude of objects very well. So that means that a new type of transponder was created a number of decades ago called a Mode S transponder. And this Mode S transponder can send air traffic control the location or the altitude of a specific aircraft within its airspace. So the air traffic control could correlate that aircraft's identification and its altitude with the blip they saw on their radar screen. But because GPS and small technology, small computers that process GPS information have become very inexpensive, it has in the past decade or so become more practical for aircraft to transmit information actively to the ground instead of the ground figuring out where exactly those aircraft are. So new technologies, ADS-B, are sort of an iteration of Mode S, which was initially created to aid radar. Now ADS-B is increasingly replacing radar because aircraft broadcast their own location down to the ground, as you can see over here on the right. This diagram from an avionics company shows that aircraft get their own position from global navigation satellites, and then they send out information on their velocity, where they are, how they're flying to the ground. And networks of small devices, ADS-B receivers, are able to pick up this data. One ADS-B antenna positioned on a roof or in a window is able to pick up hundreds of kilometers of airspace around the radius of that antenna's location. So this is a really powerful flight tracking technology. And so one of the questions is, where are these transponders used? What aircraft have ADS-B transponders on them, and what aircraft don't? And so this on the left here is a list of countries that now have state mandates for using ADS-B in all or most of their airspace and for most types of aircraft. So that extends to a very large number of countries, meaning that if you're tracking, for example, a private jet that's flying in Europe, in the US, in large parts of Southeast Asia, you will likely see that it has an ADS-B transponder, which means that you can track it on public data tracking networks like ADS-B Exchange, like Flight Radar 24. And I juxtapose this with some of you all might be familiar with AIS and maritime data and tracking ships. And the world is moving towards more use of ADS-B transponders in the same way that any large ship is required to have a AIS transponder on it and to send its location out actively at all times. So you can see New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Canada, due to COVID and some other limitations, are all working on creating new mandates, and many other countries around the world will be following suit. So what this means is that even though maybe only half of aircraft have transponders right now, that's the most interesting aircraft, first of all, because it's going to be larger planes rather than smaller ones. And it's also trending towards more use of ADS-B technology. So these are some of the resources, again, juxtaposing with AIS data that you can use in order to track aircraft and exploit this tracking data through networks like ADS-B Exchange, which has over 7,000 ground-based receivers that are hosted by journalists, that are hosted by flight enthusiasts, that are hosted by anyone who is willing to take one of these receivers, which looks like this. So you can see up at the top right here is a tweet from ADS-B Exchange with a 3D printed case of this. It's around the size of 2 credit cards as a whole, because it's a Raspberry Pi microcomputer and then an antenna attached to that. And it's easy to set up. It works with just an internet connection and a little bit of power consumption. And so C4ADS and ADS-B Exchange have been working together to send out these units in order to expand the coverage network. Because ADS-B Exchange, unlike some of these other sources like Flight Radar 24 and FlightAware, ADS-B Exchange does not remove aircraft at the request of those aircraft's owners, because this is public data. So we're trying to expand their network, and we're excited to have partnered with them to provide data for Icarus Flights. So if you're interested in getting one of these receivers, you can use the form that we sent out in Pathable in order to request more information on that, in order to put in your address, and we will add you to the list to receive one if your location is in demand. So I want to talk about some of the identifiers that we use in order to track aircraft, in order to identify them, in order to produce research on them. It's very important to understand the difference between some of these pieces of data. So the MODES hex code is the first, one of the most important. That's also known as the transponder code, or the ICAO code, or the ICAO, some people call it. And this is an alphanumeric code. You can see two examples of it here on this slide, AC1DDC, which is a hexadecimal code that indicates a specific piece of equipment on the aircraft. It identifies the transponder, and it is usually linked to a registration number. So when I go and register my aircraft in the US, for example, I will register it and they will give me a registration number like N12345, because N is the prefix for a US registered aircraft. EI is the prefix for an Irish registered aircraft, and you can see an example of this here, EIDCK. And so I register my aircraft, and the FAA issues me not only a registration number, but also a transponder code. So they issue me a MODES hex code, and I set the equipment in my plane to broadcast that anytime my plane is flying in airspace where I need an ADS-B transponder, which is all of the US at this point. Now, if I re-register my aircraft in Ireland the next year and get a new registration number, EIDCK, it's going to be tied to a new MODES hex code or a new transponder code, and I will have to change the transponder code in my aircraft. So this is one of the challenges when you're looking at historical aviation data for flight tracking specifically, is an aircraft that is re-registered in a different country will get a new transponder code, and that transponder code and registration might be reissued to a different plane in that same country at a later time. So the only identifier that you can use in order to track an aircraft across jurisdictions is its serial number, which is literally stamped on a plate inside the plane, and it's issued by the manufacturer when it's produced. One of the other identifiers that we can use in order to get information on aircraft when we see signals from them is the call sign, which often includes a prefix indicating what airline is operating that aircraft. And so the International Air Transport Association has a list of codes that airlines use. So UAL in this example is United Airlines, and 22 is the flight number. So I know that this aircraft is broadcasting UAL 22 over its transponder signals because it's flying United Airlines Flight 22. Now, these call signs aren't always perfect. Sometimes a plane will start up and broadcast a different call sign before it's changed, because this is something that can be altered at the discretion of the pilot. Sometimes aircraft will broadcast their registration number in place of a call sign. That's especially true for smaller aircraft. Like my personal Cessna, if I had one, would probably just broadcast its registration number because I am not a registered air transport operator, and that's not necessary. You can see the second example here is a Ryanair flight, which is RYR96AT. So RYR indicates Ryanair, and that's something that you can Google anytime you run into a call sign and you're interested in getting more information on what airline operates that. So as far as the actual practical application of that registration number goes, you can see on the left here that a couple years ago, C4ADS was doing an investigation in Libya. We were looking at Libya's flying armories and also flying treasuries to some extent, looking at illicit cash transactions. And so we found a video of an aircraft we believe to be a Russian jet on a runway in Libya. And you can see the red box there is where we found the registration number for that aircraft on the wing. And so we Googled the registration number and we found a listing for it on an operator's website. So we know that Sigma Airlines is claiming that they operate this aircraft, and they also tell us what kind of plane it is, so we can further corroborate that. Then we looked at some unofficial registration sources. In this case, this is an enthusiast curated website called RussianPlanes.net. And RussianPlanes.net has more information on this aircraft, including its serial number, including its age, including some of the information about its like payload weight, And so all of this is very useful. And now we can take that information and build out our investigation on that basis, just going from something we found in social media, something on YouTube, to other data sources. So that's why being able to recognize when an aircraft identifier pops up in an investigation is extremely useful. So aircraft ownership data is not the best landscape as far as transparency goes. And it's becoming increasingly difficult because private owners in European countries now, because of GDPR, can often get their information expunged from the public registries. So not every country has public aircraft ownership data available. They also don't always make available information on operators of aircraft. So you don't know which airline is flying it. Basically, every plane in the world is required to be registered in some country and have a registration number, and that's per the Chicago Convention, to which almost every country is a signatory, I believe. But you can register your aircraft in any country you want to. So if you're interested in privacy protections, you can register your plane in a secrecy jurisdiction. So an interesting company or an interesting country for this is Aruba, which has the P4 prefix for aircraft registrations. Aruba has the world's first private aircraft registry. So they run their aircraft registry like a company. And it's very modern and sleek, and you can make payments using Stripe, which is neat. But they also protect ownership information. So they will never release that. They'll tell you that an aircraft is registered to a specific registration number, but they won't tell you anything about that aircraft, which is their prerogative, but it's a jurisdiction in which if I were trying to hide my identity, I would definitely consider spending the extra money to go with their private registry and register my plane there. Also, tax liabilities are determined by which jurisdiction you register your aircraft in, and you don't have to be a resident of most countries in which you could register your plane, similar to corporate registrations and secrecy jurisdictions. Now, countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, France, the UK, and many others do publish good ownership records for aircraft. And so you can use publicly available resources that those governments and others make available in order to identify aircraft ownership information. So I go from tail number to, okay, the US says that this is registered to Jake Glass. However, sometimes Jake Glass is smarter than that, and he'll register his aircraft through a shell company or through a trust, or a third option is through an aircraft leasing company. So if there's a leasing company that holds a lien on my aircraft, then their name will often show up as the registered owner in the FAA's database. And sometimes even the FAA themselves doesn't know who the actual owner or operator of the aircraft is, even though they require registration information to be submitted. In the case of a lot of these trusts, the FAA does not know the ultimate beneficial owner of these planes, which is concerning. So you can see on the right here that I ran a search in Icarus Flights and took a screenshot of it. I looked for all aircraft that were registered to a company with the name of Wells Fargo Bank NA trustee, Wells Fargo Bank NA, etc., and tried a few different permutations of that name. And I found this is the limit of Icarus's search results, over 1,000 aircraft that were registered to that list of entities that had flown within the past few months. So this just goes to show that there are a lot of planes that publish ownership information that is really associated with some other company like the Bank of Utah, Wells Fargo, Aircraft Leasing Corporation. That makes it difficult for us to understand the ultimate beneficial owner without resorting to other kinds of resources, aside from the official records, that is. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of official aircraft registries available. Some countries do this better than others. The US, France, Canada, Australia, and UK all have great searchable databases of aircraft registration information and publish ownership information for a large chunk of aircraft. The United States actually has a National Business Aircraft Association called the NBAA. And it has a privacy protection program that they created in tandem with the FAA, which allows owners to request that tracking information and also ownership information on their aircraft be blocked from some of the things that the FAA publishes. So this is something that is becoming increasingly popular for business aircraft owners and operators, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to track aircraft. However, there are unofficial aircraft registries that are curated by enthusiasts that are really, many of them are Wikipedia-like, in that anyone can make edits, but it's a fairly responsible community of individuals contributing. And there's a lot of good data out there in these sources. So a couple of my favorites are the Open Sky Networks database that they publish and update regularly, and the GIJCs database, which is a searchable website that you can search on serial number, registration number, or transponder code. There are a couple of paid providers that offer this data as well, Air Transport Data Bank and CH Aviation being the two largest. But overall, if you take an aircraft identifier and you Google it, you will run into a lot of these unofficial sources. And even when official sources aren't available, these unofficial ones often provide very good context and can help you generate leads in order to find more entities, more aircraft of interest in your investigations. Another resource is plane spotter photos. There are a number of websites out there, the two largest of which are planespotters.net and jetphotos.com. They have millions of pictures of aircraft that are taken by enthusiasts, people who hang out at the end of the runway with a camera with a fancy lens, and take pictures of all of the planes that are taking off and landing on that day. These are great resources, especially because you can track changes in the livery of aircraft over time. So if my aircraft is registered to one person in 2018, in 2019, I see that a new logo is painted on its tail. Perhaps that corresponds to a registration change. And if the ownership information isn't available for the country in which it was registered after 2018, maybe the identifier that is painted on the plane is going to be of use to me in making a link to the ultimate beneficial owner. Military aircraft are oftentimes also trackable. Oftentimes is a bit of an overstatement. You can sometimes track military aircraft. For example, we'll see American troop transport and cargo aircraft flying over Iraq regularly because they do have ADS-B transponders on them. But some of the spookier aircraft, like the fighter jet that is pictured here, are oftentimes not going to have transponders on them. Very occasionally, you'll see like military training aircraft show up, but the frequency with which you're able to track military aircraft is much less than with private and commercial aircraft. However, there are a few really interesting unofficial databases. There are great resources online if you're interested in getting into military aircraft identification and tracking. And so Scramble is a great community and database for those that I recommend. In addition to aircraft ownership information, there are some other very useful databases, and that includes the Geneva Airport Movement Inquiries database. So this is a website that is regularly updated and shows all of the aircraft that are taking off or landing at Geneva Airport. There are some other resources that you can use even when aircraft ownership information isn't available. Sometimes countries will publish information on specific planes and their maintenance status, their airworthiness. For example, Cameroon's safety information system is a useful resource, even though they don't make ownership information publicly searchable on their website. Another great resource is Twitter. So I took a screenshot of some of the people, some tweets recently from people that I follow on Twitter. So that includes Stephen Watkins, Avi Sharf, Gerjan. These are just a few of many people who regularly watch interesting flights on flight trackers and post screenshots of those flights and do as much investigation as they can using open source data to get a better idea of why those unusual flights are happening. And when I say unusual, I just mean aircraft that are not run by a major airline and are not flying regularly scheduled routes. So this might be a cargo jet based out of Iran that flies to Venezuela one day. This might be a Turkish military aircraft that flies to Libya and back. These are all interesting flights, and there's a great community that you can follow in order to sort of dig into those. There are also resources that aggregate all of those interesting flight tweets. So one of these is liveuamap.com, which I like because it also incorporates other kinds of events, which are all geolocated on a map. So if you haven't used this before, I do recommend just checking it out. Also, there's a resource that I found very recently that is ducus.net, and it aggregates a lot of these interesting flights from Twitter and from some other data sources into a nice list of identifiers. So you can see that the call signs and the registration numbers and the origin and destination for each of these flights is indicated in a list. And so this is basically a very concise summary of all of the interesting flights that have occurred within the past couple days, which is very interesting if you want to dip your toes into flight tracking. So now that I've talked for a long time, I'm going to hand it over to Eva, and we're going to do a little bit of a practical application to what we have discussed so far.
Yep. Hello, everyone. And if you have any questions as I go through this, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're going to go through a little bit of an exercise to help you understand how to find the kind of identifying information that we use when we're tracking flights. And so after this section, you'll see how this actually applies to seeing where the planes come from and go. But before we get there, we want to have you go out into the big internet and let us know what you can find on some of the flights that we have, some of the planes that we have previously been interested in our investigations. So to start out with, we're going to go through one of the aircraft associated publicly with Yevgeny Prigozhin. If you are interested in some of the flight activity by that aircraft, you can look at some past C4ADS investigations, and there's been an abundance of open reporting on these aircraft as they've become more known. So Jake, if you could go to the next slide. Our first question for you is to determine in what country the plane with the registration number VP CSP, which is pictured here, and which was designated in US sanctions by OFAC as an associated plane with Yevgeny Prigozhin. We are looking for both the registered country and the official registration status in that country using this registration number. I'm going to give you all about 3 minutes to look into this online. As you find answers, feel free to send them directly to presenter. You should be able to DM me in the chat. And if you have questions, feel free to ask the rest of the group or ask me privately, and I'll probably send messages back to everyone. So we've seen several submissions in the chat as to where this plane is located. Jake is going to walk you through how he found this information, including some of the sources that he referenced.
Yes, okay, so I'm just going to play a little screencast video that I pre-recorded here, showing the steps to identifying the jurisdiction in which this plane is registered. So I searched for VPCSP and I didn't find the country of registration, but I know that the registration number indicates which country it's registered in. So I looked up a list on Wikipedia of aircraft registration country prefixes, and I found that VP-C corresponds to the Cayman Islands. So then I looked to see if there's an official Cayman aircraft registry, which there is. I can click on the website here. And this is caacayman.com, the Civil Aviation Authority of the Caymans. I find that there is no active current registration for VPCSP, but I can use a little bit of advanced Googling in order to search all of Google's past indexed documents, so old versions of this aircraft register that might still be around. And I do that, and I find VPCSP here as of January 2015, as you can see in the top right there. That's the date on this older version of their registration information. And I can see that this plane was registered to Springline, and that the registration began in February of 2005. And then I can also see the serial number for this aircraft. So we know that this plane, when it was associated with Prigozhin, was registered, and before it was designated by the State Department as a sanctioned asset, it was registered in the Caymans. And then it must have been deregistered because it no longer appears in the Cayman Aircraft Registry's active aircraft. So the next step for us
Yes, so the next step for us looking into this investigation is determining where the aircraft has moved to. If it's no longer registered in the Caymans, where is it registered? We have available for another of these aircraft the serial number, which, as Jake pointed out in the beginning of this presentation, is a number that doesn't change as an aircraft is re-registered. So when it's registered in the Caymans, it'll have the serial number. When it's registered somewhere else, it will also have this serial number. Now that you know that this group of aircraft are no longer registered in the Caymans, use this serial number, which we have provided you on the screen, 258210, and I'm also going to send in the chat in case you'd like to just copy it, to determine what the current registration number of this aircraft is. This time I'll give you about 2 minutes.
And an additional note is that serial numbers are not always unique across aircraft manufacturers. So it might be useful to know that this is a Hawker Beechcraft aircraft.
All right. Many thanks to Sergey in the chat for posting his approach. We have a new registration for this, and Jake is going to walk you through how he got to it and then some of the fun public reporting we have on this plane now.
Okay, great. So I'm going to walk you through another one of these little videos showing how I did this investigation. So I search for Beechcraft, and then I type in the serial number for this aircraft, which I struggled to remember. So you can see me slowly typing that. And I look and I see a bunch of unofficial sources here, one of which is Scramble, which is a great enthusiast curated database. And you can see that they now list all of the registrations, the historical registrations for this serial number over time. And they show that it's registered with an RA prefix, so that means it's in Russia. I was able to, through Russian language searching, find the official Russian aircraft registry and download that as a CSV, because I want to verify that it is currently registered in Russia and that that registration is active and that it's the same plane. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing a little bit of analysis on this CSV in an open source CSV reader called TAD, which I recommend. And I'm searching for the first part of that serial number 258 just to see what's up. And you can see that the second row in this result set is 258210, which is Beechcraft 125. And that's the plane that we were looking for, basically. And its Russian registration number is RA-8678. And it's currently registered in Russia. So we've successfully established that Prigozhin moved this aircraft from being registered in the Caymans to being registered in Russia. And this move could have corresponded to the sanctions designation that the Treasury Department placed on his assets. But something else that I want to show you here really quickly is that I could have also searched for, well, this is just replaying the video. Anyways, we'll move on to another aircraft of Prigozhin's that we noticed in some reporting in open source media. So this is just a really quick snippet of a YouTube video published by a Russian language media organization about Prigozhin. You can see the subtitles here talking about him and his family. And what they did was use social media in order to identify some of his assets when his family posted about what they were doing. In this case, you can see the registration number in the Instagram photo. And so now that we know a registration number, we can use that to do this all over again.
Exactly. So now that you have this registration number, we're looking to find what country this registration number is registered in and its official registration status. And because you've all gotten really good at this, I'm going to give you about 1 minute to do this, and then we're going to roll ahead with the answers. The registration number, if you can't see it on the screen, is MVITO. Yes, it does look like we've got some answers coming in the chat. So I'll turn it back to Jake to roll through this final investigation.
Okay, great. So we'll start again. So we're going back to Wikipedia and looking up aircraft registration prefixes by country, figuring out what M corresponds to. And you can see I'm searching through this page and I find Isle of Man is the answer here. So now I'm going to Google and see if Isle of Man has an official aircraft registry. They do, and so I can jump right into that. And I click into their database. It's actually quite nice. It lets me search on registration, serial number, also do owner name searches, which is very useful. So if you suspect that a plane is registered in a jurisdiction, you can jump in here and search by owner. So the aircraft status, of course, is deregistered. And the good news is they actually tell us what country it was exported to. So in this case, it's the Russian Federation, which makes sense given that there is a pattern of Prigozhin changing his aircraft registrations to Russia around this time period. And you can see the deregistered date is April of 2019, which I believe is around the same time as that sanctions designation, which is not a coincidence. So I'm just gonna, yeah, this is repeating that again. Okay. So we know it's registered in the Russian Federation, but figure out what its current registration number is. And we'll give you just like a minute for this as well, so that we can move on to some other tracking investigations.
All right, it looks like we have some experts and veterans of Prigozhin plane investigations in the audience. So thank you all for your contributions. And I'm going to pass it back to Jake to finish this one out. And then we'll go over how you can use the Icarus Flights platform.
Yeah, so just as an aside, the Prigozhin investigations have been done quite well. I think OCCRP did one of these a while back, or several of these. C4ADS has published some things on this as well. And lots of independent journalists as well. So it's a very cool domain. So jumping back to this, we know the serial number from the Isle of Man's registry. It shows that the serial number is 258512. I already downloaded the official Russian registry. I could also Google this. So the unofficial sources really do suffice in these cases because the unofficial sources told us the registration number. For example, scramble.nl was able to identify that. But this official source gives me additional peace of mind that that information is correct. I can see the registration number here is RA02791, corresponding to this serial number, and that it's currently active in Russia. And that's all of the information I was looking for. So we know that Prigozhin moved his assets to Russia. And actually, these don't really show up on flight trackers now, which is interesting. It's possible that they are just not equipped with transponders. It's possible that they're turned off a lot of the time. They mainly conduct domestic flights within Russia, as far as I've been able to see. And it's possible that Prigozhin's family has moved on to using other aircraft as well. So Eva is going to talk a little bit about Icarus, which is very exciting because this is something that we've been working on for quite a while, which we really hope will aid in these kind of investigations.
Yes, so once you've gone through the racket of trying to find the identification information for the planes that you're interested in, you likely want to know where those planes are going. This is where Icarus can step in to help you out. Jake and his team have been developing an incredible tool that I use every day as an analyst, and that has been incredibly helpful to C4ADS's investigations. This Icarus flight tracking platform gives you live capabilities to track airplanes globally, and it gives you unfiltered results. So as Jake pointed out, both registries and some quote unquote open source flight tracking platforms will actually wipe information of planes which request that their information be kept private. However, Icarus is dedicated to keeping all information available for all analysts and investigators everywhere. Icarus also provides a historical search capability, so you can go back into some of the historical data and look at where planes have been in addition to where they are now, and create some higher level search capabilities so that analysts can do investigations into planes that they're interested in, but also other planes with similar patterns of activity. If you could go to the next slide, I'll walk you through some of these capabilities, and then we'll launch into a live demo. So as we mentioned, commercial databases will filter or strip flights upon owner request. And these takedowns tend to be commercial jets, military jets, the kind of jets that you might be interested in looking in. Icarus, on the other hand, provides unfiltered results based on ADS-B data. So as long as we are receiving data on a plane, we will share that data back with you. Next slide. Now, as has been sort of discussed in the chat, and as we're happy to go into further, Icarus doesn't have perfect coverage everywhere. We are providing you with live global tracking, but only in the areas where we do have coverage or the ability to collect ADS-B data. So you can see on this map where we have better and worse data, and I think this is a little old, so we're filling in some of this, particularly in the Middle East. There are still major gaps in Asia, in Africa, and in some of Latin America. Where we do have data, though, we are able to provide live results, giving you unfiltered flight data with the custom query fields on registrant, location of either departure, arrival, or fly through, sort of activity by a plane over the course of its flight, in addition to the sort of ownership data that you've been looking into. This also fills in some of the gaps that commercial registrants, commercial databases often leave. As you can see here, we've provided the capability not only to search by ownership or by registration information, but also by activity of a plane. So if you're interested, for example, in all of the planes that fly directly over Washington, D.C., you can draw yourself a polygon or an area of interest and then search historically for flights in that area in that given time period. We've used this to track planes that are going from specific areas to specific other areas that follow specific flight patterns into areas that they shouldn't be going into. And this helps narrow down when you don't know the identifying information of the plane that you're interested in. Next slide. We're building out our analytic capabilities, and Jake can talk a little bit more about how these skills are developing, but this is an incredibly responsive service. It's a new platform, and it's been built for the needs of C4ADS analysts. So if you are using this platform and you decide that there are new functionalities you'd like to have, Jake and his team are willing to discuss how this platform is developing and what kind of tools we can add to improve the investigative possibilities therein. Some of the recent capabilities that have been added in include batch aircraft monitoring. So if you're interested not only in one of Prigozhin's planes, but all of them, or if you're interested in the entire Turkish fleet, we can put those together in a group and then set an alert on them to tell you when any Turkish military plane or any of Prigozhin's private jets or any corporate jet in America takes off. Those alerts are customizable by how frequently they alert you. So I have some live alerts set that email me as soon as a plane takes off, as well as some weekly summaries of this is how many airplanes have flown between these given areas over the course of a week. This can help you both with tracking individuals, but also tracking patterns of commercial aircraft flights or military flights between different areas of operation. These alerts can come to your phone or your email, so you can be getting them all the time and be constantly aware of your target's activity. Lastly, you're able to save searches so that if you're interested in something and you want to check in on it regularly, you'll be able to refresh that search whenever you return to the platform. I'm going to hand it back to Jake now for a little bit of a live demo, and we're going to go through some of the examples that you all have given us. So Jake, if you want to sort of open up the platform and give everyone a tour, and then I can take it over to go through some of these examples I have.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Eva. So I'm going to hop into the platform here and share my screen. So just give me a moment to set that up. Okay. I think you can all see this now. Great. Okay, so this is what Icarus Flights looks like. I'll actually zoom in a little bit here so that it's easier for all of you to see what's up on the screen. So Icarus has data going back to 2019, searchable. ADSB Exchange has historical archives going back to 2016. But what is currently available in Icarus at this point is 2019 to present. This is live updated. So you can get a picture of all of the aircraft that are present over the world right now. So I can zoom into a given jurisdiction and see all of the aircraft flying over them at this point. If I zoom in all the way, I'll be able to see every single plane. I can click an individual plane and I can get a little bit of identifying information on that. And we refer to this as our radar view because if you were an imaginary air traffic controller in an area, this would be a replacement for your radar because it's using ADSB, secondary surveillance radar. And so when you hover over an aircraft or a point on the map, you can see characteristics of flight. You can see some of the identifiers we talked about before, like the registration number, the MODES hex code that identifies the transponder, and the call sign. So in some cases, we can very easily identify the airline from its call sign. In this case, this plane has been flying across the US. You can see it's flown in and out of Dallas, one of American Airlines hubs. And when I zoom out, a lot more planes pop up on the map. So sorry that that's a bit jarring. But this particular aircraft is registered in the US. It has an N number. It's a Boeing 737-8, and it's operated by American Airlines, which is why we saw that its call sign that it's broadcasting at this point is AAL prefix, because that's the code for American Airlines. Some of the functionality that Eva mentioned includes creating alerts. So we built a powerful query building tool that allows you to stack criteria on top of each other in order to identify what aircraft of interest and what flights of interest you're looking at. So this is the way you create a new alert. So if I want to get an alert anytime an aircraft that's registered to a certain individual takes off, I can select and add a registrant filter. And then I can say I would like any aircraft that's registered to Quest Diagnostics, which is a company that provides medical testing services in the US and operates their own fleet of private aircraft. I can run a search on that. Maybe I only want aircraft of a certain model within their fleet. So then I can say that I only want a Cessna like 172, maybe. I'm not sure if they operate any of those, but maybe they do. I can filter down to only that model. And so these two filters are ANDed together, basically. And then I can get an email or text alert resulting from that. We also allow you to create areas of interest and lists of aircraft that you can then later track. So I'll give you a brief example that I think contextualizes this capability pretty well. This publication in Sao Paulo published an article in Portuguese, and I Google translated it for the purposes of this demo, about a number of aircraft that were basically double dipping in government funds and illicit mining funds, because the government was paying these air transport operators near Boa Vista in the Yanomami region of Brazil to fly medical supplies and food to native people there who were being disproportionately affected by illegal mining activities in that rainforest now. And the government realized that a lot of these private air transport operators were flying both equipment and food and supplies for the illegal miners and the supplies they were contracted to transport for the government. So the government seized 66 aircraft that were associated with these operations, which is great. It's unfortunate that this was happening, but it's great that the government was actually able to find them and take action. Many of these aircraft don't have transponders on them, but some of them might. So let's look, we'll draw just a shape over this area of Brazil in order to see if we come up with any interesting results that might be aircraft that were involved in this government investigation. So I'm just going to call this like Greater Boa Vista, because that's this city here. And then you have the indigenous territory of Yanomami over here along the border with Venezuela. So I'm just going to call this Greater Boa Vista and draw a shape on the map to bound my search in the future. So I'm just going to do this and I'm saving it. And then I'm going to create a new advanced search looking for aircraft that flew in that area in the month of June, let's say, just because that was well before this seizure of the 66 aircraft in early September. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I would like all of the aircraft that that had flights that were ending in Greater Boa Vista, which is that geography that I just created. I can run a search for that here, and I can see that there were 56 aircraft because I did draw a fairly large area. But some of these are smaller little planes. So for example, this, let's see, so we've got some Hawker Beechcraft, we have some larger commercial aircraft, but for example, this is a little Cessna that might be interesting. So I will go ahead and look at activity for it within June of 2021. And you can see that when I clicked on the aircraft, we get additional information that we have collected from a bunch of different sources. So we pull in unofficial and official registration data into Icarus Flights so that it's a one-stop shop for both tracking aircraft and trying to trace their historical registrations. So we have Open Sky Network data, which is one of those unofficial sources in here, and it indicates this company is the alleged owner-operator of this particular Cessna citation. So I'm going to go ahead and search for the flights that this aircraft made during June. We'll see here what comes up. What we see is that we have a bunch of flights that do go over the region where we created our area of interest and that might have stopovers there, but which are generally not traveling there. What I did earlier is I created a list of all of the smaller aircraft that flew over that area, and I called them Yanomami Cessnas. And you can see some of these aircraft had flights to southern Brazil around the time that this indictment was issued by the government. So if I go from, let's just say the past 6 months of activity for this Cessna that's actually registered in the US, I can see that its last flight was to, I believe, Sao Paulo, and that it has stayed there since, which I think is likely a sign that it was seized by the government. It is now sitting in a lot awaiting its ultimate purpose. So yeah, you can see the last flight by this aircraft, put it over here in Sao Paulo. And that previously this aircraft had been flying all around this region into and out of Boa Vista, which is interesting. And I found that just by searching on this area and then filtering down to specific kinds of aircraft I was looking for. This is Icarus Flights. It's a very powerful tool, and we have a waiting list to get access to it. And so if you put your name down there and your organization, we are rolling out access to it over time as we improve the tool, as we sort of scale up. And we're very excited to have all of you involved in this and also helping expand our coverage network by hosting receivers and conducting interesting investigations on aircraft that you're interested in yourselves, which is why I'll now hand it back to Eva to use Icarus in order to look at some of the planes in the last few minutes we have before we jump to Q&A that you all submitted through that form.
Definitely. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to just walk through, I think, one of the first submissions we got in this for this presentation, because it's a helpful display of how some of the questions that you have can be answered by looking in Icarus Flights. So somebody submitted, I think at the beginning of our opening of this form, whether we could search for these two registration numbers, TCGVA and TCGVB. Now, I didn't know anything about these planes, but I did know that TC, the prefix for the registration, is a Turkish registration. I looked that up on Wikipedia, and you can do that too. And looking for those aircraft, I went into Icarus Flights. I created an advanced search, and one of our advanced search functions is looking by registration. And so searching for these two aircraft, I very quickly found that there were, in fact, both of these aircraft. Now, this one, TCGVB, hasn't been active recently, but TCGVA, the first of these aircraft, if you look for the last 6 months, oh, sorry about that. If you look for the last 6 months, actually has a ton of activity. Now, the question was whether this plane had been going to Latin America. We didn't find that in the last 6 months. However, we find a few flights going to Canada and to the US. We also find flights going around Western Europe, and we can see that this plane is possibly based out of Istanbul. It's coming in and out of Istanbul a lot. We can also, if we're interested, look into what information Icarus already has about this plane. Now we have it owned by Turkish Airlines, and it is in fact Turkish Airlines livery. And we have photos taken by fans and sort of those who are interested of the plane, likely when it's at some of these different locations. If you go to these links, you can actually look at where these photos were taken and why folks found it interesting at that period of time. I am going to open it up now to Q&A and also switch back to a view where I can see the chat. However, we have a few extra investigations. So as you all ask questions, if it's relevant, we'll go back to the Icarus view, and I'm happy to stay on later if anyone has any specific questions about how Icarus works. I see that Serdar has a hand up. Serdar, do you want to go first asking a question out loud, and then we'll go to the question in the chat?
Hello. Well, this has been very informative, and it's a great tool. So I thank you very much for introducing this great tool. About the flight that the airplane that you just showed, TCGVA, I know that it went to Brazil in August, for example, but we didn't see it on the map. Why is that?
So sometimes aircraft don't show up in Icarus for one reason or another, just depending on what kind of data points we receive from them. We're working on refining our algorithm that detects the origin and destination of flights, because we don't rely on flight plans like some other flight trackers. We rely on the tracking data, which means that our algorithms aren't perfect at this point, and we're working on improving those. So sometimes data will not show up, and in those cases, I'm actually interested to know about that because we're working on improving the tool as much as possible right now. So that sounds like a data gap, and I will look into that and see what we can do.
Okay, thank you.
We have, I think, the next question from the chat, and I'll read it out, Jake, so that everyone hears it before you answer it. You mentioned several times the non-fitting or non-use of transponders. Are there any particular risk profiles of planes and their owners or operators who increasingly don't appear, or appear in some regions but not others where they used to fly?
I think this is the sort of investigative question that now that we have Icarus, we can start to delve into. There are no specific typologies associated directly with the use, non-use, non-fitting of transponders that I'm aware of. At this point, But that's something that I think does warrant further investigation. And I think it's a very good question because we've heard rumors that aircraft, for example, crossing over the US border from Mexico, carrying narcotics, often turn off their transponders. And this isn't something that I've observed directly in the flight tracking data, but it is something that's pretty generally understood to be a fact of life, that aircraft will sometimes turn off their transponders when they don't want to be seen. And that's something that I would be interested in learning more about, honestly.
I see a question in the chat that I know is of Jake's interest and up Jake's alley. Mike Eckel asks, does the Icarus tool account for transponder GPS or GLO and ASS spoofing?
Yeah, so I'm very interested personally in global navigation and satellite system spoofing. And Icarus, one of the little bits of research that we've been doing recently is using Icarus in order to identify events where aircraft either travel at an impossible speed, so there's a jump in their paths that might indicate some sort of GPS GLONASS spoofing or jamming in that area. For example, this happens a lot in the Mediterranean, which is an area of very high RFI activity or radio frequency interference on the frequencies that GPS uses. And so in the next couple of months, we'll be rolling out a feature within Icarus that is an event that says either the navigational integrity of that aircraft degraded, and that sudden change might indicate it went into a zone where spoofing was happening, or the aircraft traveled at an impossible speed. And then you will be able to conduct searches on that. So yes, that is an interesting question that we have been investigating ourselves. Yeah, thank you for referencing that. That's one of the reasons that I started working at C4ADS is because of that report. Are there other questions? I know that we've gone through a lot here. Great. Okay, so there's one more question, which is if someone wants to start flight tracking, does she or he need a data receiver to be installed at home? And the answer is no. There are public flight tracking websites, including ADS-B Exchange, including Flight Radar 24, FlightAware, Radar Box. Many of those, Flight Radar 24, Radar Box, and FlightAware are commercial entities, and so they will block aircraft at owners' requests and have a profit incentive to offer increased privacy protections in some cases. ADS-B Exchange, which is the network that we use for Icarus Flights, does not block any aircraft intentionally, which means that it's a great source. And ADS-B Exchange data is available in its raw form, as well as access to Icarus Flights to investigators on a pro bono basis. I think that is it as far as questions we have. If you go into Pathable and look at that form, you can put your names on a list to get access to Icarus Flights as we roll access to the tool out. And as we continue to improve it, bring in more sources of registration and ownership data, and hopefully create lots of interesting journalistic impact in some of these flight and aircraft investigations. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us afterwards. I believe that some of our contact information has been posted in Pathable as well as here, and we would be more than happy to talk to you about specific investigations or answer any further questions you have. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Eva, before we?
Nope. Thank you all for participating. I'm dropping our emails and that form one more time in the chat. So if you don't see it on Pathable, feel free to click on it now. And if you have any other additional questions, I know there were folks who are interested in both the PowerPoint and in looking more at Icarus Flights, feel free to reach out to us directly and we'll happily engage. Thank you all and have a lovely whatever time of day it is for you wherever you are.